to be true. Angel baby, my angel baby.
I'm Dennis Lim. I'm a film programmer and critic, and also the artistic director of the New York Film Festival. I think of Edward Yang as one of the most important filmmakers of the late 20th century. Yang was absolutely recognized in his lifetime. He showed at film festivals and was a critic's favorite. But I think at the time of his death in 2007, only one of his films, Yi Yi, his final film, had received US distribution. He's been recognized by a lot of younger cinephiles. And I think that part of the reason for his recent popularity is that these films have been out of circulation for so long and so little seen, relatively speaking.
醒嘴，男人会衰。
会衰，黐線嘅。
But I think what's really at the heart of Yang's continued popularity and relevance is the fact that he's a filmmaker who really understood his moment. He is a filmmaker for complex times.
你总不能见死不救吧？良心上也过不去啊。
良心？哦，我还要不要吃公家饭？
The first Yang film I saw was A Confusion, Confusion. And I remember being really struck by how much was going on in this film. It had elements of almost like screwball farce.
Mary，我跟你讲啊，我感觉你的婚姻是上进步的呢，不但保持了传统美德，而且还标榜夫妻个人的独立自由。
The film seemed to understand what certain tendencies in Taiwanese society were doing to the people who existed there, who sort of operated within this hypercharged atmosphere of the 90s, as there was this large influx of money. And it was a moment where the interpersonal was increasingly blurred with the financial.
我在看你们公司的财务报表的时候，我觉得很感动，因为我发现，其实，在内心你跟我一样是充满热情。
Yang was a leading figure of what came to be known as the new Taiwanese cinema, or the Taiwanese New Wave. And this is a movement that emerged in the early 80s when Yang had just moved back to Taiwan from the United States, where he studied and worked. And he was alongside Hou Hsiao-hsien, who is his exact contemporary. They were both born in 1947. And actually worked together. Hou Hsiao-hsien has a starring role in Yang's second feature, Taipei Story, and was also a co-writer of it. And between the two of them, they made some of the most important films of the 20th century. This movement coincided with this transformative period in Taiwanese society. Taiwan had been under martial law since 1949 and lasted nearly 40 years, and the 80s were a period of this progressive liberalization for Taiwan and of this new wave of young filmmakers trying to understand the complex situation of their country. Taiwan had a history of being occupied by a number of countries: Japan, China, the US. The 80s is Taiwan's passage from authoritarian rule to a democracy. And the 90s is another period of transformation just in terms of the spread of global capital, something that he dealt with in several of his films. And I think the world that you see in Yang's films is in some ways the world that has come into being, as the world we exist in. And there's a clarity with which he's observing how these changes affect human relationships. I also think of him as one of the great filmmakers of urban life and urban space. For the most part, his films are set in Taipei, the city where he grew up. And like cities, Yang's films are dense. They are sometimes sprawling. They are built on these interconnections, and they're full of life. Yang's style, to a large degree, is a cinematic language that was popular at the time. You could say descended from neorealism and inflected with European modernism, this kind of like meditative cinematic language that relies more on wide shots, that's somewhat durational and observational, that doesn't use close-ups as much, that actually asks you to step back a little bit from the action instead of immersing you in it. I've always thought that this cinematic language of distance in Yang is kind of key to what his interests are. It's often thought of as a language that is somewhat cold, distant, removed from the action. But I think that in Yang's hands, more than in any other filmmaker, this kind of language actually speaks to his curiosity and a certain kind of analytical intelligence. I think basically for him, to understand people requires stepping back and observing them in the systems in which they exist. I think he was great at situating his characters in particular environments, in the environments that shaped them, whether it was a city or a family, a workplace. I think this sort of analytical side of Edward Yang, I think you can trace it to perhaps his background in the sciences. And there are certain elements of how he frames and composes his films that you can trace to his interest in comics and graphic novels and manga. But if you look closely at Yang's films, I think there is quite a bit of variation in rhythm and in mood. His first 3 films, I think you see a filmmaker actually kind of playing with cinematic language and form.
唱国歌了你还动啊？全部给我站好啊！
And he makes, with his 4th film, this really mature, like stately epic. A Brighter Summer Day was the film that made his reputation. I remember it as a film that was, talked about more than seen in the 1990s. And then he pivots and makes these 2 films in the 90s, A Confusion, and Mahjong, which have a little bit more of, you could say, like genre stylization in them. Confusion is essentially a comic question of whether Confucianism and capitalism are compatible as belief systems.
害人之心不可有，防人之心不可无嘛。没听过这个话，好像孔子讲的吧。
And Mahjong has elements of like kind of a gangster thriller.
快快走走，拉鼓走。
我记我第一遍看你的手嘛，你变高多，你会记我视频顶看电影，过武昌街时阵火车来。
And then he goes back to, I think, the mode of A Brighter Summer Day to make, because we didn't know it would be his final film at the time, Yi Yi, which contains all of human emotion.
我想这样故意啊，我当看你的手。无关呢，动作无共款，时间无共款，年纪嘛无共款。
If I were to recommend an entry point to the work of Edward Yang, I would say start with Yi Yi. It's maybe unusual to say start at the end, but there is something that feels like a culmination in that film. It's a film that includes a birth and a death and a wedding and a funeral, and like it's multi-generational. It is in some ways an attempt to see how much of human feeling you can put into a film. And that's something interesting about Yang, too. It's a relatively small and compact body of work, but I'm often amazed at just how much it contains, how much ground he covered in terms of characterization, but also just how much historical and social context is present in his films.
跟日本人打了8年仗，现在去日本房子听日本歌。
So Yang had interesting collaborators from the start. His first feature, That Day on the Beach, stars Sylvia Chang, who's one of the biggest stars in Taiwan, certainly at the time. And it was shot by Christopher Doyle, a cinematographer who would go on to be really well known for his work with Wong Kar-wai. A Brighter Summer Day stars a very young Chang Chen, who was discovered by Edward Yang, and I think it still is one of the biggest stars in East Asia, known for his collaborations with Wong Kar-wai and other filmmakers. I actually have a hard time pointing to a personal favorite of Yang's films simply because I think I value each of the films for different reasons, and that's especially clear as you return to them.
有问题啊？没问题嘛？
I will say that I think the 90s films are underappreciated, Confusion, and Mahjong. And maybe because it was the second Yang film that I encountered. A Brighter Summer Day, I think, is one of the great films about adolescence. And also Yang's probably most autobiographical film, a film that is inspired by this actual murder case that was very shocking at the time. But that is part of the film. But Yang really turns it into this really fully imagined and inhabited portrait of a time. And you feel like it's a film that's, put together from sense memories of somebody who lived through this moment.
你会给我唱首猫的歌好不好？
唱，你唱猫王，我还唱 Connie Princess， 也不需要放弃。
I think the reason I keep coming back to Yang as a touchstone filmmaker is because he's somebody who was able to see through the murk of what was happening. It's quite hard, I think, to grasp the present, especially when things are changing, faster than we can apprehend. But I think he understood how larger forces were reshaping our lives and our relationships with one another. And I think a moment like ours could badly use a filmmaker like that.
爸比，你看这个我看不到，我看这个你也看不到啊，我怎么知道你在看什么呢？
你问的问题，爸比都还没想过了。可是我们不是有照相机吗？